We are now past the halfway point on our 40-day journey through the Fairy Realms. It's day 21, and that's the first day in the Book of Water, which is basically going to take us into the hidden city of Murius, which is one of the most secretive realms in all of Fairy, and it's also one of my personal favorites. I absolutely love exploring the underwater and mirror realms and all of that. So I'm really excited to do this particular part of the series. And I'm just going to start by reading out from the first day. I won't be able to write out on the map exactly where I am until we get a little bit further through, just because of the secretive nature of how you enter into this realm. I'll also mention here that I wrote that the word tide, as applied to the ocean, is very much connected to the word time, as it stems from an Old English word which means point or portion of time, period or season, or division of time. And that is actually also why you have the three blind mice next to Hickory Dickory Dock, down by the dock of the bay, as a kind of double meaning here with the connections of time to the tide. And basically, we're going to be traveling into the future for this, and I will explain more about all of this as we go. But first of all, I will explain from day one. I walk towards the green ocean. The hooded beings at the shore seem to be hesitant about me entering the water, but I immerse myself regardless. The water is clear enough to see a long way ahead in all directions, and it is warm. I continue to swim deeper and deeper, and up ahead I can see several feminine forms seeming to call me towards them. As I swim closer, I am confused by various reflections of color, light, and mirages, which have me turning my head in several directions and forgetting which direction I am meant to be traveling. In the physical world, I entirely forget which way I am lying down, even though I initially went into the experience well aware that my head was facing the western direction. I spend some time watching many small seahorses who are all swimming in their own little pool area. Before I know it, I am deeply immersed in the ocean, and I find myself swimming through all types of underwater passages, tunnels, and openings. There are also large doors that seem to be made of very thick wood, with symbols on them, one of which is the crescent moon carved on an angle, and I drew a very small picture of that crescent moon, because actually it turns out to be significant which way it is facing, and we'll get into that in a moment, but that's how I drew the crescent moon. And I explain here, eventually, deep on the ocean floor, I find a large trapdoor of sorts with a big metal and round looped handle on it which I can pull. As the opening is revealed upon pulling at the handle, I see all kinds of small spirits, shapes, colors, demon faces, and so on, which leap up and out into the ocean as though I have released some darker forces. The words Pandora's box come to mind vividly. Where all the beings have escaped from, there opens a small passage inside which gets smaller and smaller until it is the size of one single grain of sand, a tiny pinpoint of an opening. Somehow I know how to shrink my consciousness all the way down to just a pinpoint size and enter through this smallest of doors, with my spirit being just small enough to slip in. I think of Jesus' words about a camel going through the eye of a needle. Okay, I'm just going to mention here. So, in one of the previous episodes in the air world, I traced out a hidden path that I had taken, which basically ended up creating the shape of this dragon on the map. And it will be remembered that the eye of the dragon was basically drawn in the underwater part of the reflection of that bridge, which is basically like the reflection of a very needle-like point that became that sort of slit in the eye. And this is right next to Pixie Point, and we're thinking here of the point of the needle going through the eye of a needle, and there's a literal dragon eye that was drawn in this location. And the water babies are completely on the other side, representing that rebirth and renewal. That's based on a particular book where all of this is mentioned, but next to here, we've also got the Beach of Pearls, and I'm talking here about, something the size of a grain of sand, because I also mentioned that not only do I think of Jesus' words about a camel going through the eye of a needle, but the more specific words which enter and imprint themselves upon my mind are from William Blake's poem, which says, "To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour." So we've got that time reference very much like hourglass and sand and all of that, but also this tiny pinprick of an opening that's the size of a simple grain of sand. And when I was referring to Pandora's box and all those strange things and demons and all that that came out of it, and then there was this tiny pinprick of an opening, I added here, perhaps of further relevance here is the pearl and the clamshell. A clamshell is an enclosed area which could be compared to a shut-up box, and a pearl is developed inside this shell as a defense mechanism against a potentially threatening irritant, such as a parasite inside the shell. A pearl sac is created to seal off the irritation, meaning that pearls are the result of an immune response. Though it is said to rarely be the reason why, it is commonly thought that a single grain of sand can act as that irritant through which the pearl is formed. And I said, could it be that the parasitic evil forces held within Pandora's box also naturally, miraculously caused the equivalent of a pearl of hope to form, some beautiful hidden portal amidst evil? And so basically, that idea of the Beach of Pearls being here, Pixie Point, the Eye of the Needle, and the water babies on the other side is a very clear indication that this is the area that I was in when I was basically first entering to get into the water realms. But this is just the beginning, and it gets much more confusing because eventually I actually take a right where it says, here do they make snow and ice, all the way across to the very edge of the map, so far that the other side of the map basically begins. So what happens with this map is that when you go all the way in one direction, you end up at the far opposite extreme of the other direction of the map because it goes around. So I wrote here that on the other side of the pinprick opening, my consciousness then re-expands and my spirit resumes its normal size. There are heavy waterfalls which I can loudly and clearly hear all around and in front of me, and I can feel their water on my head and back. You can see here where it says they make snow and ice that there's this, you know, you see all these lines coming down. Whether this is like connected with some of what felt like the waterfalls, I'm not sure. But basically I'd gone through a complete reset and I didn't actually have any concept of hot and cold and all of that. It was just more, everything just kind of was pouring down upon me. This sort of waterfall, heavy waterfalls is what I explained loudly and clearly. And I say, I have to pass through these and past the rocks to get to the deeper ocean on the other side of them. And so this actually leads to the complete other side of the map. And you have to basically line it up. And that leads over to where it says Nightmare Point. So on one side you've got Pixie Point, and on the other side you've got Nightmare Point, where night hags do swarm. And this again is related to that idea of Pandora's box that I was referring to, where all of these evil forces seems to get released out into the ocean, these dark faces and dark demon-like things, and this is all connected with the Nightmare Point. It says the great sea serpent lieth fathoms deep. And interestingly, in this same book, a little further on, I actually quoted from the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, which says in the Hymn of the Pearl, go down into Egypt and bring back the one pearl in the middle of the sea, surrounded by the hissing serpent. So yeah, just interesting that here we've got Nightmare Point, the great sea serpent lieth fathoms deep. And you'll also see that it almost looks like a crescent moon shape at the top of Nightmare Point. Very similar to the one that I drew when I said that, you know, I opened up that trapdoor, which was connected to that whole Pandora's box. And it looks very similar to that crescent moon, but it's basically that crescent moon on the map would have to be turned a quarter direction clockwise in order to match up to the one that I drew here. And there's actually a reason for that, because we're basically going to be traveling into the future. So it now says, soon I discover an underwater golden chariot or carriage of sorts with large water horses attached to it. And you'll see that just down here at the bottom past the Bay of Moaning, you've got here rideth Neptune and his Tritones. And it says these be Tritones, and B is spelled B-E-E, which again reminds us of the sting of a bee or a needle or a pinpoint. You know, Jesus mentioned faith the size of a mustard, like a grain of mustard. Again, where we're talking about grain of sand and everything before. He mentioned faith the size of a grain of mustard. If you look up the original Greek word for mustard seed, like when he says a grain of mustard seed, it actually comes from a word synope, which means to hurt or to sting, very similar to like a bee. And actually the end of that word, API, is very similar to the scientific name for a honeybee, which is APIS. Yeah, so basically a honeybee is APIS, and the word for mustard or mustard seed ends with API, synope. And actually on the other side in the south, on the map, you've got the Alf Mal head, and Mal is the prefix of Melissa, which means the queen of the honeybees and everything like that. So yeah, there's definitely this connection here to faith, the grain of a mustard seed, the bees, the stinging, the tiny little pinprick point, and all of these things that are coming through here. The other thing with the Tritons, in relation to the fact that this is actually the 21st day, so we just crossed over the halfway point, you often think of a sort of interlude when you're, since we're going for 40 days, 20 days would be sort of like an interlude, or the interval between the two, like a pause between. And that's interesting because a tritone is actually sort of a musical scale as well, and it's also been called the devil's interval because of these sort of airy notes that are said to sort of call up evil spirits and things. And the other meaning of Triton, the son of Neptune / Poseidon, was also said to be Triton, a sort of merman, I believe. And it's also the name of, there's this particular Triton's trumpet. It's a sea snail. It's also called Coronia tritonus. And what's interesting is that that particular snail is one of the very few animals to feed on the crown of thorns starfish. And the crown of thorns starfish basically, is named because of its resemblance to the crown of thorns around Jesus's head. And if we're thinking of how Triton or Tritone is connected to the devil's interval, it's interesting that the particular sea snail that happens to eat the crown of thorns, representing sort of a Jesus figure, is actually, the same being that has the word tritone connected with the devil in it. So you on the map you have these be tritons, and next to it you have crowned fish, which reminds us of the crown of thorns, which is a particular starfish which is eaten by the tritonus, or the sea snail that's connected with the tritone or the devil. So yeah, just very intriguing connections coming through here with that as well. And of course a star is also, has those points around it. So this is again, we went from Nightmare Point, Pixie Point, the points on a star, the point on a bee sting. So all of these things have this connected symbolism happening here. Now the other thing is, when we appeared at Nightmare Point, I know that I did not fall straight down because I never had anything to do with the part which says this island is enchanted. And I do know that the water realm is associated with the west direction. So here we have the west beacon. And so you can basically draw a line from Nightmare Point and across over to the west beacon, which would be guiding us into the correct location. And so we're going around the island, which is enchanted, which at times I've actually speculated may even be Earth itself, but I'm not exactly sure yet. So we go around that and down past the Bay of Moaning, and then into basically the center of where Neptune rideth with his tritones, because it's like the interval or in between. So you go through that center point, and that creates a particular shape, which is very reminiscent of one of the letters that came through in the Undine alphabet, which I get a little bit later on. And that's the letter there, which represents the letter L, which means guidance, secrets, calm, quiet, hidden portals, and invisible help. This particular symbol would have to be turned a quarter direction clockwise in order to match up to the symbol from Nightmare Point going down to in between where Neptune rideth with his Tritones. Again, this is indicating that things are being turned forwards by a quarter direction, which is exactly the same with that crescent moon. It has to be turned quarter direction forwards. This is the idea of traveling forward in time, going into the future. Whereas when I was talking about the south world in the Fire Realms, I explained about how we were turning the compass one quarter direction anti-clockwise, because it was almost like we were going into the past and history, and it was based around Egypt and these desert realms and everything that seemed to be almost like historical, whereas here we're actually going further forward into this place beyond time. And actually there's a great lyric that I believe Prince wrote, which is on the album of one of his proteges called Bria Valente, and there's a beautiful song on there called Immersion, the very title being reminiscent of water and everything like that. But there's lyrics that actually are very relevant to all of this in that song, because the lyrics say, her dreams now turned to the water glistening, to the words come in and go, to a place where time it has no meaning, and a space where there are no more walls. Very adept in the art of receiving, she finally got the call. Come in, go, immersion. Very adept in the art of releasing, she let all of her inhibitions go. With the unexpected shock of a bee sting, she got pulled into the future and into the new world. Welcome to the place much faster than time, the true reality where only peace you'll find. Come and go, immersion. So that's like really, really relevant to this, what I was explaining with the bee stings and all of that. So basically, I explained that we continue on this direction. So I say, by water horses, I refer to something which appears to be made of will, intention, and magic, and who seem to be part of the water itself, moving in unison with the movements under the ocean to pull the golden carriage along, which is invisibly attached to this powering force. These water horses are at times invisible, unless they are specifically in movement. There is a woman in the carriage who I sit next to, and she has dark black hair, faded blue lips, and the deepest, darkest pupils. There are glass-like windows at the back of the carriage which can be seen through. So basically where these water horses are, that these beings are riding on, for me, I was actually in a carriage, a golden carriage, and it was being pulled along by those water horses. And that's actually something that is associated to Neptune. And later in my analysis of it, I did actually mention Neptune being pulled along by those water horses. One of the reasons that this part of the brain shares the same name as a seahorse, I was referring to the hippocampus, is because they are very similar in appearance. Interestingly, the hippocampus, in the sense of part horse, part fish, has also often been depicted as pulling Neptune's chariot, which is somewhat reminiscent of the experience that I had of an underwater and golden chariot being pulled along by water horses. And I said Neptune is of course the god of the sea in Roman religion. His Greek equivalent is often thought to be Poseidon, god of the sea and of horses. He has been regarded as a tamer or father of horses. One of Poseidon's half-brothers is Chiron the centaur, who both share Cronus as their father, who's connected with time. Cronus, horses, and centaurs in general are very much associated with timekeeping and chronologies, and Poseidon is also the father of the winged horse, Pegasus. So anyway, I explained that the carriage and water horses move now in union and perfect harmony with the natural movement of the sea, which is also a kind of musical sounding tone. And actually where you've got the Castle of Seven Towers, which is very near to the Tritones and everything like that, in the book that references the Castle of Seven Towers, it's actually sometimes referred to as the Tune of Seven Towers. So there's definitely this connection to notes, because there's often 7 notes in music as well. So all of these things are coming through for a reason. And so basically I'm traveling along this whole way through all of the storm area, and basically where it says 100 fathoms, 200 fathoms here, and I'm traveling along here in this water carriage, all the way to where it is the Bay of the She and the Undine Bay and Green Harbor. And the reason that Green Harbor is probably symbolic of somewhere where I landed nearby there is because you have Mrs. Bond there. And in the poem or nursery rhyme of Mrs. Bond, there's mention of a character called John Ostler. And the name Ostler is actually representing somebody who looks after horses. So I was arriving there, being pulled along by these seahorses, basically, and the water carriage was left there. So there is a actual connection in that nursery rhyme to Oslo, which is connected to a person who keeps horses. So I likely arrived somewhere around there. And I say, eventually we reach the shore and the water horses seem to dissolve into thin air. The carriage, however, remains at the shore with a very royal appearance and dripping with seawater as I step out. The beach is made of completely white sand, something I've never seen as white before. I'll also mention that this was not as if I was arriving back at the exact same location that I was in when I was at the Air World. Remember that the fairy shrine cross is over next to Kilmany's house, and often based on where you come from when you go to a location, the fairy shrine can represent things being quite significantly different or leading to a completely other location or teleporting or transporting to a completely other part of the map. And it just depends on what you did before you got there. So the fact that I'd just gone around that entire thing and under the ocean and everything, that transforms the way that this appears. So this, at this point, basically was this white sand beach. And one of the symbols here to help represent exactly what I'm talking about is the fact that you've got Snow White and Rose Red over there. And both of them are from a Grimm's tale about Snow White and Rose Red, where each one of them represents a different season, in a sense. In the book itself, it says, in front of the cottage there was a garden where there stood 2 rose trees, one which bore white and the other red roses. She had 2 children who were like the 2 rose trees. One was called Snow White, the other Rose Red. And it mentions that Rose Red liked better to run about in the meadows and fields seeking flowers and catching butterflies, but Snow White sat at home with her mother and helped her with her housework or read to her when there was nothing to do, which is much more connected to the idea of autumn or winter, whereas the other one, Rose Red, is more connected to spring and summer. So depending on what time you go there or what time you travel there or which way you go there, the entire location can be quite significantly different. And there's hints of this on Bernard Slay's Ancient Map of Fairyland on the guide. It says, "Go if you can always in the early spring, for then the whole land is blushing with wild roses, shimmering with golden, thornless broom, or white with wild waving lilies. The waterways are safer too, the dangerous western currents going to sleep and leaving the quiet seas as peaceful as a mountain tarn." So yeah, there's like hints at what I'm talking about here. And so that idea of Snow White and Rose Red actually comes into this too, because I explain the beach is made of completely white sand, something I've never seen as white before. Around the outside of the beach are many trees, which are very tropical in their appearance, similar to palm trees, yet of their own unique design and not quite like anything that I've seen on Earth before. And that whole jungle tree area is actually over where it says the Magic Forest of Lioness, which we've explored in both the Fire Realm and in the Air Realm, both of those being quite different depending on where you go from. And it is different again when you go there from the Water Realm. So it's located at the same place on the map at the Fairy Shrine, but it looks completely different based on where you're going there from. I noticed that walking towards me from the left side and near the ocean waves is quite a tall woman who I recognize as a sea queen. She has shells and flowers in her long and curly golden hair. As she walks towards me, I hear the name word asphodel resounding deeply in my mind. The asphodel is a wild flower which has been heavily connected to the Greek underworld or a place for certain spirits of the dead, also known as the asphodel meadows. And so that word meadow links in with where it was Snow White and Rose Red, because it mentioned that Rose Red liked better to run about in the meadows and fields seeking flowers and catching butterflies, but Snow White sat at home with her mother and helped her with her housework or read to her when there was nothing to do. Now, of course, those 2 children are said in the story to be so fond of each other that they often go with each other holding hands, and they don't ever want to leave each other, and they go and they sleep out in the woods and all these kinds of things. So yeah, it's basically referring to the fact that this particular location is harmoniously interwoven between those 2 things based on where you're going there from. It can be quite a different experience. So I tell her, this is the sea queen woman who had the shells in her hair and everything like that. I tell her that I don't want to leave this beautiful place and that I want to keep exploring instead of return back to where I came from. And she says to me that I would never have to. And then she says, "You will always be here now, so long as you wish." And you can see right next to where Snow White and Rose Red are, there is a wishing well symbol. And so I was basically standing right there, and she said, "You will never have to leave here so long as you wish. You can wake in physical reality, but your spirit shall remain here to resume whenever you return." So in relation to the bee sting and the pinpoint size consciousness, like how you had the city of Shagpat and the sword is also connected with the point of the sword. You've got nightmare point, you've got pixie point, you've got the bee sting, all of these things to do with that pinprick point and the pearl and all of that. It's all symbolic of this particular state of consciousness that you have to enter in order to get there. It's very similar to a state that I think that would call samadhi, or that sort of ecstasy, or that idea of basically having no thought, or the moment just before thought. And where it says here are no soundings, that is also, basically no way of measuring the depths of the water there, or how deep it goes. But as a double meaning, it's also a place of completely like emptying, quieting the mind of everything and all of these things in order to make your way through. That's also the idea of bringing your thoughts down to one single point. And this is because when you enter the water realms, it's very much heart space. It's not about the mind. It's about heart, and it's about feeling and emotion and all these kinds of things. It's a similar concept to what Samael talked about in his book Logos, Mantra, Theurgy, which says, "A still small voice incessantly resounds within the cells of the human brain. This is a sharp hissing sound. This is the sound of a chirping cricket, the hissing of the serpent. As the bee absorbs itself within the nectar of the flower, likewise the mind of the student should be absorbed within that sound. Whoever wishes to perceive this sound has to empty the mind, must quiet the mind, but not forcefully quiet. We repeat, quiet. Let us perceive the difference between a mind that is quiet because it is comprehended that it is useless to think, and a mind that is artificially quieted. Understand the difference between a mind that attains a spontaneous, natural silence and a mind that has been silenced by force, violently. When the mind is quiet, in profound silence, the student can then inevitably perceive the sound of the cricket, a subtle, sharp, penetrating sound. Moreover, if the soul of the student is absorbed within such a mystical sound, then the doors of mystery open up. Consequently, in those moments, the student can rise from their bed instinctively and leave the room. They can go towards the temples of the White Lodge, or to any place in the universe." And you may have heard of binaural beats, or the idea of playing one tone in one ear, a slightly different frequency tone in the other, and then the brain creates this third tone in the middle. It reminds me of, the tritones, meaning like three, and how you have like these two horses on one side, and then you've got one forward in the other. It reminds me of that almost in the way that it creates this third warbling tone from the brain based on the difference between those in order to put you into these different brain states. And sometimes this has been referred to as hemisync by, I think it was Robert Monroe, who studied out-of-body experiences, that perhaps coined this term, I'm not sure. But what's interesting is like hemisync, that idea of syncing the brain in that way, actually does connect with the scientific name of crickets as well, because they're called Hemiptera, Ptera, with that hemi prefix. And when you lay down with crickets on either side, they induce that altered state of consciousness through the sound of their chirping. So that's one of the things he's referring to here. I also wrote that Hugh Min in the Fairy Way book described this same state of mind when he said, "Just now, for a moment, close your eyes and rest your mind in the space before thought. In that space, which is referred to in the teachings as a dimensionless point, and whose symbol is a palm tree, is the entrance to Fairyland. Before the mind breaks up the flow of experiences into discrete observable quanta, before it pigeonholes every sense datum into its vast filing system, there briefly arises the shining realm of fairy." So just to give really brief info on Murius, where we're actually headed, I wrote here that in early Irish literature, there are the four cities of the Tuatha Danann, known as Findius, which was the fire realms that we've explored, Gorius, which was the air realms that we explored, Murius, which we're about to explore, and Felius, which is the earth realm. Each of these also contain four magical items: the sword, the spear, the cauldron, and the stone. So the cauldron being connected with the water realms, or the cup. This was the item that I use for my journeys. Oh, it's got like an aquamarine in there. This is that's the cup that I use for these journeys as my elemental item. And Murius and the cauldron are the city and item which are most associated to the water world in the west. which also corresponds to the season of fall or autumn. Fiona MacLeod has written, "The symbol of Murius is a hollow that is filled with water and fading light. Does the wave hide Murius? Do not the prows sail over fallen crowns and spires of dim gold, and the pale palaces of Murius, whose tale was told ere the world was old? I go, or am, as the wave that idly flows, where the pale weed in songless thicket grows, over the towers and fallen palaces, where the sea city was, the city of Murius." So the last thing that I wrote here in this chapter is an invocation of the Undines, and you'll see over here it says Undine Bay right next to Snow White and Rose Red. I do believe that the water horses likely came into where it says Green Harbor, somewhere around there. And later I came back to that location and everything was different, and I believe that that's when I went to Undine Bay, because that's actually when I met with an Undine who gave me the Undine alphabet. And that was in that same area when I had come back around. Undines is a term coined by Paracelsus, the word being related to the Latin word unda, U-N-D-A, which means wave or billow. And they are known as elemental beings specifically associated with water. I talked a little about these when I was talking about the water nymphs and things in the previous episodes. The term first appeared in Paracelsus's book titled A Book on Nymphs, Sylphs, Pygmies, and Salamanders, and on the Other Spirits, which was published in 1566 after his death. The Undines are said to usually be found in forest pools and waterfalls, where their singing voices can sometimes be heard over the water. There are apparently many different types of species of water beings who come under this same title of Undine, such as mermaids and sea nymphs, etc. Now, I believe it was on the first day of the Fire Realms that I mentioned about Dr. William Moon's alphabet for the blind, and how I unlocked that by going from the 3 blind mice to Little Tuck to Little Bo Peep, all symbols of blindness, creating that V shape, and then mirroring that up to where the moon is, which was also associated with Valhalla and Asgard, which was connected with Odin, who was blind in one eye and who had a blind son. So there was all these symbols of blindness. And that the moon basically was unlocked as a symbol of blindness because in 1818, William Moon brought through the alphabet for the blind. And I mentioned that 2 of the letters hidden on Oberon's shield with dots next to them are actually found on that alphabet for the blind. But what made them somewhat difficult is that depending on which way you turn the letters, it would change their meaning. So for example, the letter that looks like a letter L underneath those turtles, basically on that alphabet could represent a letter E, the letter L, the letter M, or the letter Y, depending on which way it was read. And so I said that this was quite a genius way of hiding different words that could mean different things based on which way you turn each letter. And if you actually had to turn every individual letter in a certain direction, and all of them meant something different depending on which way they were turned, you would have basically like this giant Rubik's Cube of sorts that could represent books worth of information just from 8 letters. If we're going to take that word closest to those turtles at the top there, and it basically has that sort of upside down owl shape, and next to it is actually a symbol that looks very familiar as, you know, the omega symbol in Greek, which represents the letter O. And next to that is also seen in Greek, and it can represent KS, or like almost like an X. And so if that letter that looks like an owl was actually the letter L, that would spell locks, L-O-K-S, locks. So the only letter that would be remaining out of those 3 in that case would be that last one, which looks very much almost like an I. And if we were to assume for a moment that it was an I, or did represent that, that would read Loxy, L-O-K-S-I. And Loxy is actually a modern alternative form of Luke-C, L-U-K-S-I. And that word in Chickasaw language, which may seem somewhat obscure, but it is interesting to think also that the Chickasaw tribes did form an alliance with Britain, where Bernard Slay was from, so it's not entirely impossible, Bernard Slay being who drew the map, of course. But what's interesting is that Luxi in Choctaw or Chickasaw language can mean tortoise, turtle, as well as padlock or lock. And of course, right above it, we have those turtles being represented in the water. But if we were to put this whole map upside down or reflect it, because I do think that the Water Realms is very much a reflected realm, or almost like you turn the whole map, flip it horizontally or something along these lines. If you were to do that, obviously, and read that more in reverse, it would actually read ISKUL, or Iskul. And this would remind us also of like a school of fish or something like that. But Iskul, ISKUL, is actually a word found in Baybayin, Baybayin, connected with Tagalog language in the Philippines. And so this actually means school, like, again, like a school of fish or something like that. And actually, this is not entirely irrelevant to the idea of a turtle either, because the scientific name of a turtle is Testudines, which really sounds like testing students. Testudines. And there's actually a hidden-necked turtle also called Cryptodira. But interestingly, when you think of a shield, like Oberon's shield, and you think of a turtle is a very good symbol of a shield, because they have like that hard cover protection shield. And the significance of Baybayin, we've got the Bay of the She, we've got Undine Bay. So we've got these basically references to Bay or Bye. If you look at their letters, there's actually one that is very, very reminiscent to another letter that is found on Oberon's shield. It's the letter that has that's in the same row as the other one that has the dot to it, right underneath Loxy for turtle. The last letter there, it looks basically like either an upside down or inverted version of the Baybayin letter for Ya, Y-A. You can see it's very, very similar to that letter. And that letter in itself is very, very similar to that letter L that came through in the Undine alphabet when we were falling down from Nightmare Point down to where Neptune was riding with the Tritones. And it created that symbol that was very, very similar to that particular letter. So I believe that as you unlock some of the words, it basically unlocks letters that will then help you to unlock the next words on the shield. And each one that you unlock can then be read in multiple directions. I believe that you can probably read almost all of these in at least 4 directions. And I also think it's very much like a combination lock, where depending on which order you're reading them in and which way that they are individually turned will completely change the entire meaning of the words that are around. But that there are these core meanings that you can first tap into. And I believe that that first one is basically Luxi or Iskul, meaning turtle, or a school, or a combination, or padlock. And I also believe, like I have mentioned before, that the plus found inside of Oberon's shield is like at the bottom of the Mercury symbol. The circle of the compass is like the circle of the Mercury symbol, and that part at the bottom is basically like that crescent moon, or the cow horns that are supposed to be at the very top, so flipped upwards like that at the top of the shield, which would put Loxy at the bottom, which would then connect to where you've got the turtles on the bottom right, because rather than that being the top right, that would then become the bottom right by flipping it upwards like that. It's to match with the symbol of Mercury. So I believe that that's basically being put there all in coded form for that purpose. And Luke is also short for Lucifer, who's connected to Mercury, and you had to basically use the Mercury symbol in order to see that. And it's also the double meaning of the sea or the ocean, which again, it's hidden in this lock. So that's as far as I will go with that right here. I just wanted to sort of, I was going to say touch the surface of it, but I guess that's diving pretty deep. There's a lot to uncover, a lot of deep, deep mysteries that come through in this particular series. And I will finish this first episode by reading out a poem that was given to me by Hope Diamond to include in this book. When I was first traveling to the Water Realms, I saw this poem of hers and I had to reach out and say, can I put that in the book, because it just stood out so much to me. It really felt like it was a guided message that I was guided to see it. And her name also being very connected to that idea that I was talking about with Pandora's box, because in some versions of it, all that's left is hope inside. Like when you've got all the darkness and all the evil and all that came out, like at the Nightmare Point, and there was that small pinpoint of hope that was there. And so it felt very, very relevant to include a poem also by Hope Diamond for that purpose as well. But this was just the most beautiful poem, which really seemed to summarize the land where we're going. So it says, midnight flowers bloom with jasmine sprinkles in a tomb. I stand and wait for you by the shores of Gitchigami, waiting for the lake to give up her dead. But she never does. Under the sea live schools of fishes who whisper to me in strange dreams, dreams that tell me of an oblivion beyond me, beyond the sea, a place where seagulls stand at sunrise, and strings of peaches hang from daffodil trees and dandelions in the wind. How am I supposed to be here? And how can this be, seeing I know not a man? The ways of the world are strange, but the ways of the world down under the world are even stranger, darker at times, a darkness that eats up the light and puts it forth in all her coating in wide wonder, a darkness that will hold you and cherish you fathoms under the sea, while the great stretch of sunshine that is a beach waits for you on the other side.